The morning of November 7th, 1943, a Luftwaffe airfield near Cayenne, in occupied France, ground crews looked up from their morning duties as the unmistakable growl of an American radial engine echoed across the Norman countryside. At first, they assumed it was one of their own Focke-Wulf 190s returning from patrol. The sound was similar enough, but as the aircraft broke through the cloud layer and began its landing approach, confusion rippled through the assembled Germans. It was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, massive, unmistakable, painted in full United States Army Air Forces markings, and it was landing on their airfield. Lieutenant William E. Roach shut down the engine and slid back the canopy, his face showing the exhaustion of a pilot who had pushed his fuel reserves to the absolute limit. He expected to see the familiar faces of his ground crew at Steeple Morden. Instead, as his eyes focused on the men approaching his aircraft, he saw field grey uniforms and weapons pointed directly at him. In that terrible moment of recognition, Roach understood his mistake. Poor weather had disoriented him. The airfield he thought was in southern England was actually deep in occupied France. He raised his hands slowly and climbed down from the cockpit. His war, at least as a pilot, was over. He would spend the remainder of the conflict as a prisoner at Stalag Luft 1. But for the Luftwaffe, something far more valuable than a single captured pilot had just fallen into their hands. They had acquired the first complete, flyable P-47 Thunderbolt, and with it, the opportunity to answer a question that had been haunting German fighter pilots for 6 months. How does this ungainly American monster survive battle damage that would obliterate any other fighter in the sky? The Germans moved quickly. Within hours, American markings were painted over with Luftwaffe crosses, and the code T9+FK was applied to the fuselage. The aircraft, which Roach had nicknamed Beetle, was flown inland immediately to keep it away from Allied strafing attacks. Its destination was Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's premier aircraft testing facility, where the best pilots and engineers in Germany would dissect every aspect of its design. What they would discover in the months ahead would fundamentally alter German fighter tactics and force a grudging respect for an aircraft they had initially dismissed as a flying barrel, clumsy, oversized, and destined to be easy prey for the agile fighters of the Reich. But to understand why the capture of this single P-47 mattered so much, we must go back to the spring of 1943, when the Thunderbolt first appeared over Europe and German pilots got their first real look at what the Americans were sending against them. April 15th, 1943, 25,000 feet over occupied Belgium. The morning sky was clear, dangerous weather for bomber operations, but perfect for fighter combat. Captain Werner Schroer of Jagdgeschwader 26 was leading his Staffel on an intercept mission when he spotted the American fighter formation approaching from the west. He keyed his radio, and his voice carried a note of genuine disbelief. "The Americans are flying barrels." It was not meant as a compliment. The Luftwaffe pilots had grown accustomed to the sleek lines of the Supermarine Spitfire, the elegant profile of their own Messerschmitt Bf109, and the compact power of the Focke-Wulf 190. These were fighters that looked like fighters' purpose-built machines of speed and agility. The P-47 Thunderbolt looked like something designed by a committee that had never seen an airplane before. Its fuselage was enormous, almost comically bulbous. The radial engine jutting from the nose gave it a blunt, aggressive appearance, but the sheer size of the cowling made it seem ponderous rather than threatening. The wings were short and thick, lacking the graceful taper of European fighters. Fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, the Thunderbolt weighed 8 tons heavier than some light bombers. German pilots, confident in their training and their aircraft, saw the P-47 as an easy target. Here was an American attempt to build a high-altitude escort fighter, and the result was this grotesque flying bathtub. Jokes began circulating immediately among Luftwaffe squadrons. One popular quip suggested that the best way for a P-47 pilot to take evasive action was to unbuckle his straps and run around inside the cockpit, the implication being that the fuselage was so cavernous there was actually room to do so. When Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected aces and a veteran of the Battle of Britain, later had the opportunity to examine a captured Thunderbolt, he reported with wry amusement that the cockpit was indeed big enough to walk around in. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The P-47's introduction to combat had been anything but smooth. The 4th Fighter Group, composed largely of former Eagle Squadron pilots who had flown Spitfires with the Royal Air Force, greeted their new mounts with something between skepticism and outright hostility. These were men who had learned to fight in nimble British fighters that responded to the lightest touch on the controls. The Thunderbolt, by comparison, felt like wrestling a freight train through the sky. Captain Don Blakesley, an experienced and highly regarded pilot, flew the P-47 for the first time and complained bitterly to anyone who would listen. The aircraft seemed reluctant to leave the ground on takeoff and anxious to get back on it as soon as possible. In flight, it lacked the instantaneous response of the Spitfire. Royal Air Force pilots who visited American bases to inspect the new fighter shook their heads with genuine sympathy and told their American colleagues, in the understated British way, that they were probably going to die. The Thunderbolt's first combat sorties in April of 1943 did little to dispel these concerns. The aircraft had problems. Engines overheated. Radios failed at critical moments. The landing gear proved temperamental. Pilots complained that the rate of climb was mediocre at best, a serious liability for an interceptor designed to protect bombers from high-altitude attacks. And while the P-47 could dive like a meteor, actually pulling out of those dives required significant physical effort from the pilot. The control surfaces were heavy, the stick forces high. This was not an aircraft that forgave mistakes or rewarded finesse. German intelligence officers compiled reports on the new American fighter, and their assessments were uniformly dismissive. The P-47 was too heavy, too slow in the turn, and too large a target. Yes, it carried 850 caliber machine guns, impressive firepower, but what good were guns if you could not maneuver into position to use them? The prevailing wisdom in the Luftwaffe was simple. Avoid head-on attacks where the Americans' guns could be brought to bear, force the Thunderbolt into a turning fight, where its weight became a liability, and dispatch it with superior agility and pilot skill. This was the doctrine. This was the plan. And for a few weeks, it seemed to work reasonably well. Then came June 26, 1943. And a young American lieutenant named Robert Samuel Johnson. Robert Johnson was not supposed to be a fighter pilot. He had trained as a bomber pilot, and his transition to fighters was somewhat accidental, driven more by the urgent need for pilots in the expanding 8th Air Force than by any particular aptitude for single-seat combat. He was assigned to the 61st Fighter Squadron of the 56th Fighter Group, a unit that would eventually become known as Zemke's Wolfpack, named for its aggressive commander, Colonel Hubert Zemke. Johnson was young, 23 years old, and on the morning of June 26th, he was scheduled to fly his 13th combat mission. 48 P-47 Thunderbolts took off from their forward operating base at RAF Manston in the late afternoon. Their mission was straightforward: provide escort for B-17 Flying Fortress bombers returning from a strike against Villacoublay airfield in the suburbs of Paris. It was the kind of mission that had become routine, grueling, dangerous, but routine nonetheless. The Thunderbolts would fly out to meet the bombers at a predetermined rendezvous point, shepherd them back across the channel, and land with enough fuel remaining to avoid an emergency. Johnson was flying at the rear of the 61st Squadron's formation, a position that required constant vigilance but also offered some measure of protection from the more experienced pilots ahead. As the P-47s approached the rendezvous point near Forges-les-Eaux, Johnson was scanning the sky, looking for the familiar silhouettes of the bombers. He did not see the 16 Focke-Wulf 190s of the 2nd Gruppe, Jagdgeschwader 26, diving out of the sun behind him. The first pass scattered the American formation. Aircraft broke in every direction, pilots shouting warnings over the radio, the careful discipline of formation flying dissolving instantly into the chaos of a knife fight at 400 miles per hour. Johnson's Thunderbolt was hit almost immediately. He felt the impacts before he heard them, a series of heavy thuds that shook the entire airframe. Then the noise arrived, the hammering of cannon shells tearing through aluminum, the sharp crack of the canopy shattering above his head, the roar of wind suddenly howling through the cockpit. 21 20mm cannon shells struck at his aircraft in that first devastating pass. 21. Each shell was a high-explosive projectile designed to destroy aircraft structure and detonate fuel tanks. One shell grazed Johnson's right leg, embedding shrapnel deep into the muscle. Another shell sent fragments through the instrument panel, destroying half his gauges. A machine gun bullet, smaller, but travelling at high velocity, grazed the tip of his nose, ripping away his oxygen mask and leaving his face streaming with blood. The hydraulic system ruptured, spraying fluid throughout the cockpit. Worst of all, fire erupted somewhere behind the instrument panel, and black smoke began filling the confined space. The Thunderbolt, responding to the catastrophic damage to its control surfaces, snapped into a violent spin. Johnson, bleeding and disoriented, felt the aircraft begin to fall. The horizon tumbled, the altimeter unwound. The G-forces pressed him against one side of the cockpit and then the other as the P-47 corkscrewed toward the earth. He knew, with the absolute certainty that comes in moments of mortal danger, that he had only seconds to escape before the aircraft became unrecoverable. He reached for the canopy release. The manual said it would slide back smoothly, allowing him to climb out and deploy his parachute. But the canopy had been damaged in the initial attack. It moved 6 inches, barely enough to get a hand through, and then jammed solid. Johnson braced his feet against the cockpit floor and pulled with all his strength. The canopy did not move. He tried again, panic beginning to override training, and still the canopy remained locked in place. Through the gap, he could see the French countryside rotating below him, fields and forests and roads, all growing larger as the Thunderbolt fell. He was trapped. If he could not regain control of the aircraft in the next few seconds, he would die in the wreckage scattered across some anonymous French field, and his body would be buried by the Germans in an unmarked grave. And then, impossibly, inexplicably, the fire went out. Johnson never understood why. Perhaps the initial flames consumed all available fuel in that section of the aircraft. Perhaps the violent spinning motion of the dive starved the fire of oxygen. Perhaps it was simply luck, the kind of random chance that separates the living from the dead in combat. But the fire went out, and the smoke began to clear, and Johnson could see again. He kicked the left rudder pedal with all the strength remaining in his injured leg. The Thunderbolt shuddered, resisted, and then slowly, agonizingly slowly began to respond. The spin slowed. The nose started to come up. At less than 5,000 feet, with his altimeter still unwinding, Johnson leveled the wings and pulled the aircraft into straight and level flight. His instrument panel was largely destroyed. Hydraulic fluid covered the inside of the windscreen, and his eyes, already swollen from the rife, caustic fluid, could barely focus. He was alone, separated from his formation, flying a crippled aircraft over enemy territory. His only thought was to reach the channel, to get far enough west that he might have a chance of ditching in sight of British rescue boats rather than coming down in occupied France. He pointed the nose of the Thunderbolt west and concentrated on keeping the wings level. Oil pressure was dropping. The engine was running rough, the cylinder head temperatures climbing into the red. Every control input required physical effort. The hydraulics that normally powered the flight surfaces were gone, and Johnson was flying on cables and manual reversion alone. He did not know how long the engine would continue to run. He did not know if the aircraft structure would hold together. He did not know if he would remain conscious long enough to reach safety. And then he saw the Focke-Wulf 190 sliding into position behind him. The German pilot was Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, though Johnson would not learn his name until many years after the war. Meyer was not a novice. He was the commander of the 2nd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader II, a unit with a formidable reputation. He was an experienced combat pilot, a skilled tactician, and by the end of the war, he would be credited with 102 aerial victories before his own death in combat in March of 1944. On this particular afternoon, Meyer had already expended his 20mm cannon ammunition in the initial pass that had crippled Johnson's Thunderbolt. But he still had his machine guns, two 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns mounted in the engine cowling, and he had every intention of finishing what he had started. Meyer positioned his Focke-Wulf behind and slightly below Johnson's aircraft. From this angle, he had a clear field of fire, and Johnson had no way to maneuver defensively. The American's Thunderbolt was flying straight and level, trailing smoke, clearly damaged beyond any hope of effective combat. It should have been a simple matter to close the distance, put a sustained burst into the engine or cockpit, and watch the P-47 go down. Meyer opened fire. The machine gun rounds hammered into the Thunderbolt's fuselage, punching through aluminum skin, shredding control cables, tearing through non-structural components. Johnson, hunched behind his armored seat, could hear each impact. The noise was continuous, overwhelming, like being inside a drum while someone beat on it with hammers. He could not see behind him. He could not evade. All he could do was maintain straight and level flight and hope that something vital would not be hit before Meyer ran out of ammunition. Seconds passed. The hammering continued. Johnson felt impacts in the wings, in the tail, in the fuselage directly behind his seat. He felt the aircraft shudder and yaw as control surfaces were damaged. And still the Thunderbolt flew. In desperation, Johnson kicked his rudder pedals left and right, making the crippled fighter yaw back and forth in an attempt to spoil Meyer's aim. The German pilot adjusted easily, following the clumsy maneuver, continuing to fire. Johnson reached forward and managed to trigger a short burst from his own guns, firing blindly backward in the vain hope that he might force the German to break off. The burst was poorly aimed and ineffective, but it demonstrated that the American was still fighting, still conscious, still refusing to accept the inevitable. Meyer pulled his Focke-Wulf alongside Johnson's Thunderbolt, close enough that both pilots could see each other clearly through their canopies. The German pilot stared at the American aircraft in visible disbelief. He was close enough to see the damage. The shattered canopy, the holes punched through the fuselage, the oil streaming back from the engine, the bent and torn control surfaces. By every reasonable assessment, this aircraft should not be flying. It should have broken apart. It should have caught fire. It should have fallen from the sky minutes ago. And yet here it was, still maintaining altitude, still heading west, still somehow airworthy. Meyer lined up for another pass. He closed to point-blank range and emptied the remainder of his machine gun ammunition into the Thunderbolt. The bullets struck home, there was no question of that. Johnson could count each impact by sound alone. But the P-47 continued to fly. Finally, with his ammunition exhausted and the English Channel coming into view ahead, Meyer pulled alongside Johnson one last time. The two pilots made eye contact across the gap between their aircraft. Meyer shook his head, a gesture that seemed to convey both frustration and respect, and then rocked his wings in the traditional salute between warriors. He rolled away and headed back toward France, leaving the crippled American to make his own way home. Johnson, barely conscious, his face covered in blood and hydraulic fluid, his eyes swollen almost shut, continued west. He crossed the channel at minimum altitude, following the white line of surf below as his only navigation reference. He made landfall over the English coast and began searching for any airfield where he could land. His landing gear was inoperative. His flaps were gone. He would have to belly land the aircraft, sliding it in on its fuselage and hoping the structure would hold together long enough to dissipate the energy of impact. He found the emergency field at Manston and lined up for the final approach. There were no calls to the tower, his radio was dead. There was no hydraulic pressure to lower his gear, the system had been shot away. There was only the final glide, the aircraft settling toward the runway, the moment of contact, and then the terrible grinding noise as the Thunderbolt slid across concrete with its belly on the ground, throwing sparks, shedding pieces of damaged metal, finally coming to rest in a cloud of dust and smoke. Ground crews ran toward the aircraft. Johnson could not open the canopy from inside, it was still jammed, so they climbed up and forced it open from the outside. They had to help him out of the cockpit. His legs would not support his weight. His hands were embedded with shrapnel. His face was burnt and swollen. But he was alive. Then the ground crews looked at his aircraft, and they understood why the Germans had begun to fear the Thunderbolt. Johnson tried to count the bullet holes. He walked slowly around the aircraft, still unsteady on his feet, and began tallying the damage. He reached 100 holes on one side of the fuselage alone and gave up. There was no point in continuing. The Thunderbolt was not merely damaged, it was, by any reasonable engineering standard, destroyed. He counted 21 distinct impact points from 20mm cannon shells, large, ragged holes where high explosive rounds had detonated against the airframe. Each of those impacts, on a less robust aircraft, would have been catastrophic. Each one should have been enough to bring down the fighter. And yet the Thunderbolt had not only remained airborne, it had carried him more than 100 miles back to England, flown on manual controls with no hydraulics, landed without gear or flaps, and protected him well enough that his injuries, though painful, were not life-threatening. 5 days later, after treatment for his burns and shrapnel wounds, Johnson was declared fit for duty. His new P-47 was delivered with a name already painted on the cowling, Lucky. It was an accurate assessment. Johnson would go on to score 27 aerial victories before the end of his combat tour, making him one of the highest-scoring American aces in the European theatre. But the mission of June 26th remained the defining moment of his war, the day when he learned, in the most visceral way possible, exactly how much punishment a Thunderbolt could absorb and still bring its pilot home. It was a lesson the entire 8th Air Force would learn over the coming months, and one that German pilots, attacking what they assumed was an easy target, would learn to their cost. But learning a lesson from combat experience is one thing. Understanding why that lesson is true, understanding the engineering and design philosophy that made the P-47 nearly indestructible requires a different kind of analysis. It requires taking the aircraft apart, piece by piece, and examining what makes it work. And that is exactly what the Luftwaffe intended to do with Lieutenant Roach's captured Thunderbolt. Rechlin, Germany. Late November 1943. The P-47, designated T9+FK, sat in a hangar at the Luftwaffe's premier testing facility, surrounded by technicians and test pilots. The aircraft had been thoroughly inspected upon arrival. The engine had been run up on the ground. The control systems had been examined. Now it was time for the most important test, actual flight by experienced German pilots who could provide a professional assessment of the American fighter's strengths and weaknesses. The pilots selected for the initial evaluation flights climbed into the cockpit and immediately noticed the differences from German fighters. The seat was wide and comfortable. One pilot would later compare it to a lounge chair, a stark contrast to the cramped, utilitarian cockpits of the Bf-109 or FW-190. The instrument panel was clearly laid out, with large, easy-to-read gauges. More importantly, the critical engine instruments were color-coded green sections, indicating safe operating ranges, red sections indicating dangerous zones. This was a thoughtful design feature that allowed pilots, even those who could not read English, to monitor engine parameters at a glance. In combat, when decisions must be made in fractions of a second, such details matter enormously. The canopy was a revelation. Unlike the side-hinged canopies of German fighters, the P-47's canopy slid backward on tracks. This meant it could be opened partially in flight, useful for cooling on hot days or for improving visibility during landing approaches. The amount of glass was extensive, providing exceptional visibility in most directions. The so-called bubble canopy variant, which had not yet reached the European theatre in large numbers, would improve this even further. But even the standard razorback version offered better visibility than most Luftwaffe fighters. The test pilot started the engine, and the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp roared to life. This was a radial engine, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, air-cooled, producing 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. German pilots were familiar with radial engines. The BMW 801 in the Focke-Wulf 190 was a radial, and it had proven itself to be robust and reliable. But the American engine was larger, more powerful, and coupled to an extraordinarily complex turbo-supercharger system that filled much of the fuselage behind the cockpit. The first flight was cautious. The test pilot took off, climbed to altitude, and conducted basic handling tests. He found the Thunderbolt to be stable, almost boringly stable in cruise flight. The controls were heavy, requiring more physical effort than German fighters, but this heaviness translated into steadiness. The aircraft did not wander or require constant corrections. It flew where it was pointed and stayed there. For escort missions lasting 4 or 5 hours, this stability would reduce pilot fatigue significantly. He tried some gentle turns. The roll rate was impressive, better than expected for such a large aircraft. The P-47 could reverse direction quickly in a rolling maneuver, but sustained turns were another matter. The Thunderbolt bled energy in tight turns, and trying to match a Bf-109 or FW-190 in a turning fight would be futile. This confirmed what German pilots had observed in combat. Do not try to outturn the American fighters. But the test pilot also noted something else. The Thunderbolt recovered energy quickly in a dive. Its weight, which was such a liability in a climb or sustained turn, became an asset when diving. The aircraft accelerated rapidly, and its terminal velocity in a dive was higher than any German fighter could achieve. If an American pilot found himself in trouble, he could simply push the nose down and extend away, and there was nothing a German fighter could do to catch him. The high-altitude performance was remarkable. The turbo supercharger maintained engine power well above 25,000 feet, altitudes where German fighters began to struggle. At 30,000 feet, the Thunderbolt was still a potent fighting machine, capable of high speeds and effective combat maneuvers. This explained why American bomber escorts typically flew at extreme altitudes, diving down on German interceptors rather than trying to climb up to meet them. But the most significant discovery came when the Rechlin engineers disassembled portions of the airframe to examine the internal structure. What they found was sobering. The P-47's radial engine was a massive assembly, and unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines used in most German fighters, it had no vulnerable cooling system. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 with a punctured coolant line would overheat and seize within minutes. A Thunderbolt could lose entire cylinders, literally have them shot away, and the engine would continue to run. The remaining cylinders would compensate, producing reduced power but still enough to keep the aircraft flying. German pilots had reported this phenomenon from combat, but seeing it confirmed through technical analysis was unsettling. You could shoot a Thunderbolt's engine repeatedly, score solid hits, and still not bring the aircraft down. The fuselage structure was equally revealing. The turbo supercharger system required extensive ducting to route air from the intake beneath the engine back to the supercharger mounted near the tail, and then route the compressed air forward again to the engine. This ducting filled the bottom of the fuselage, creating what amounted to an unintentional crumple zone. In several documented cases of P-47s that had crash-landed, post-accident analysis showed that this ducting had absorbed impact forces that would otherwise have killed the pilot. It was not designed as a safety feature. It was simply a byproduct of the engine installation, but it served that function nonetheless. The armor protection was extensive. The pilot sat behind a thick slab of steel plate that could stop any rifle-caliber bullet and most cannon shells. Additional armor protected the oil tank and other critical systems. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, using a rubber lining that swelled when punctured by bullets, closing the holes and preventing fuel from pouring out. This was technology that all modern fighters use to some degree, but the American implementation was particularly effective. And then there was the sheer structural strength of the airframe itself. The wings were thick and heavily built, designed to carry not just the .850 caliber machine guns and their ammunition, but also external stores, bombs, rockets, drop tanks. The wing spars were massive. The ribs were closely spaced. The skin was thicker than on comparable German fighters. All of this added weight, yes, but it also meant that the P-47 could sustain damage that would cause structural failure in a lighter aircraft. Bullet holes in the wings? The Thunderbolt flew on. Cannon shell detonations in the fuselage? As long as they missed something critical, the aircraft held together. It was not elegant, it was not efficient by peacetime engineering standards, but it worked. The Rechlin report, when it was completed and distributed to operational Luftwaffe units, was blunt in its assessment. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not an easy target. It could absorb astounding amounts of damage, Engaging it required careful tactical planning. Head-on attacks were suicidal. The Americans' 850 caliber machine guns could destroy a German fighter in seconds. Attacks from the rear had to be pressed home with determination, and even then, there was no guarantee that the Thunderbolt would go down. The best tactic was to avoid engagement entirely if possible, to focus on attacking the bombers, and only deal with the escorts when absolutely necessary. One German ace, Heinz Baer, who would survive the war with 220 aerial victories, summed up the Luftwaffe's new understanding in a single sentence. The P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. It was an admission, grudging but honest, that the flying barrel was something far more dangerous than it appeared. But understanding the Thunderbolt's capabilities in a technical report was one thing. Ensuring that every frontline pilot in the Luftwaffe understood these lessons, actually saw the aircraft, flew against it in controlled circumstances, and learned the proper tactics required a different approach. It required taking the captured aircraft out of the testing facility and bringing them directly to operational units. It required demonstrations, training exercises, and mock combat. It required what would become known as Circus Rosarius, the Rosarius Circus. Hauptmann Theodor Ted Rosarius was not a typical Luftwaffe officer. He was a test pilot, an engineer, and a pragmatist who understood that the Luftwaffe's greatest weakness in late 1943 was not a lack of aircraft or even a shortage of fuel, though both were becoming problematic, but rather a critical shortage of experienced pilots. The replacement pilots arriving at frontline units were younger, less trained, and often had never seen the enemy aircraft they would be expected to fight. They knew the Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf from their training schools, but the American P-47, the P-51 Mustang, the P-38 Lightning, and the British Spitfire and Typhoon were just names and silhouettes on recognition charts. This was dangerous. A pilot who did not understand his enemy's capabilities was a pilot who would make fatal mistakes. Rosarius proposed a solution. Take the captured Allied aircraft that had been evaluated at Rechlin and other test facilities, form them into a special demonstration unit, and tour the operational airfields of the Reichsverteidigung, the Home Defense Force. Show the pilots what these aircraft looked like on the ground and in the air. Let them see the strengths and weaknesses firsthand. Conduct mock engagements where experienced test pilots flew the Allied aircraft against German fighters, demonstrating proper attack angles and defensive tactics. It was, in essence, an early form of what would later be called dissimilar air combat training, the same concept that would give birth to the United States Navy's Top Gun school decades later. The proposal was approved, and by early 1944, Circus Rosarius was operational. The unit's official designation was 2nd Staffel of Versuchsverband Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, the Trials and Research Unit of the Luftwaffe High Command, but everyone simply called it the Circus. The name was apt. The unit travelled from base to base like a touring show, bringing with it an improbable collection of Allied aircraft, all repainted in Luftwaffe markings. At various times, the Circus operated P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, captured Spitfires, even a flyable B-17 Flying Fortress that had been forced down intact and repaired by German mechanics. The logistics of maintaining such a varied fleet were nightmarish. Each aircraft type required different spare parts, different maintenance procedures, different fuel and oil specifications. There was no supply chain for American or British aircraft within Germany. Every broken component had to be fabricated or adapted from German parts. Every maintenance issue required improvisation, and yet, somehow, the circus maintained a decent operational readiness rate. The mechanics assigned to the unit were among the best in the Luftwaffe, men who could look at a damaged P-47 fuel pump and figure out how to rebuild it using parts scavenged from a Focke-Wulf or cobbled together in a machine shop. The demonstrations followed a standard pattern. The circus would arrive at a Luftwaffe fighter base, typically staying for 2 or 3 days. The captured aircraft would be parked on the flight line alongside German fighters, creating a surreal tableau. Imagine the scene. A young Luftwaffe pilot arrives for his morning briefing and sees, sitting peacefully on his own airfield, the very aircraft that had been trying to kill him the previous day. The P-47s with their distinctive broad cowlings, the P-51s with their elegant lines and underslung radiator, the Spitfires with their elliptical wings, all wearing Luftwaffe crosses and swastikas, looking oddly out of place but undeniably present. The first phase of the demonstration was static. Pilots were encouraged to examine the aircraft up close, to sit in the cockpits, to understand the layout of controls and instruments. For many young pilots, this was their first opportunity to see inside an enemy fighter. They could judge the visibility from the cockpit, understand the pilot's field of view, and identify blind spots that could be exploited in combat. They could examine the gun installations, the armor plating, the fuel tank locations. This was intelligence that could save lives. The second phase was dynamic. The circus pilots would take the Allied aircraft aloft, sometimes singly, sometimes in formation, and demonstrate their capabilities. A P-47 would take off and climb to altitude, showing its rate of climb and acceleration. Then it would enter a dive, accelerating to speeds that German fighters could not match, demonstrating why trying to pursue a diving Thunderbolt was futile. The aircraft would perform rolls, showing its excellent roll rate, and then attempt tight turns, demonstrating how quickly it bled energy in sustained turning combat. All of this was narrated over the radio for the assembled pilots on the ground, with experienced instructors explaining what they were seeing and what it meant tactically. The third phase was mock combat. A circus pilot flying a P-47 would engage with a Luftwaffe fighter, typically a 4-190 or Bf-109, in a controlled dogfight over the airfield. The German pilot would attempt various attack approaches, and the outcome of each would be discussed afterward. Head-on pass? The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns gave it a decisive advantage. The German pilot would have been shot down. Diving attack from above? Effective if the German pilot could achieve surprise and had enough altitude advantage to complete the attack before the Thunderbolt could reverse. Turning fight at medium altitude? The German fighter had the advantage, but only if the American pilot was foolish enough to accept the engagement. The experienced P-47 pilot would simply roll inverted, dive away, and extend to a safe distance before the German fighter could bring guns to bear. These demonstrations were invaluable, but they also carried a bitter undertone. The very fact that the circus existed was an admission of weakness. The Luftwaffe was reduced to showing its own pilots captured enemy equipment because there was no other way to provide adequate training. The peacetime Luftwaffe, with its extensive training programs and experienced instructor cadre, was gone. The pilots who had learned their craft fighting in Spain, Poland, France, and the early years of the Russian campaign were mostly dead or permanently grounded by injuries. The replacements were learning on the job, and the job was killing them at an unsustainable rate. One Luftwaffe pilot, Walter Dahl of Jagdgeschwader 300, later described a circus visit to his unit's base at Verischhofen. He arrived one morning to find the flight line transformed. Enemy fighters such as P-51s, P-47s, Lightnings, along with the heavy bomber types, could be seen peacefully arrayed alongside our own machines, he wrote. Their appearance over the field would normally have provoked anything but a friendly reaction. The surreal nature of the scene stayed with him. These aircraft, which represented death when encountered in combat, were now parked like trophies or teaching aids, stripped of their threat but not their colourless significance. The circus operated throughout 1944, travelling from base to base, conducting demonstrations for fighter units, night fighter units, even flak batteries. The anti-aircraft gunners needed to learn aircraft recognition just as much as the pilots did. But as the year progressed and the strategic situation deteriorated, maintaining the unit became increasingly difficult. Allied air superiority meant that moving the captured aircraft from base to base was dangerous. There was always the risk that a circus pilot flying a P-47 in Luftwaffe markings would be shot down by marauding American fighters who would not recognize the German insignia in the heat of combat. Fuel shortages meant that demonstration flights had to be curtailed. Spare parts became impossible to obtain. By early 1945, the circus was effectively grounded, its aircraft sitting idle on dispersed airfields, waiting for parts that would never arrive. The captured P-47 that had once been Lieutenant Roach's Beetle flew with the circus until sometime in late 1944 or early 1945. Its final disposition is unclear. Some records suggest it was destroyed in an Allied strafing attack. Others indicate it was simply abandoned when fuel ran out and the unit could no longer operate. There are photographs from April of 1945 showing a P-47 with Luftwaffe markings sitting in a hangar at Göttingen, damaged and apparently beyond repair. Whether this was Beetle or one of the other captured Thunderbolts operated by the Luftwaffe is uncertain. What is certain is that the aircraft, which had provided such valuable intelligence to the Germans, ended its service the same way most German military equipment ended in 1945, worn out, abandoned, and overtaken by the Allied advance. But the lessons learned from that aircraft and from the hundreds of combat encounters between P-47s and German fighters had already been absorbed by both sides. The Luftwaffe understood that the Thunderbolt was a formidable opponent that required careful handling, and American pilots understood that they were flying an aircraft that, while not the most agile or the fastest in all regimes, would protect them and bring them home even when catastrophically damaged. This mutual understanding shaped the air war over Europe in the final 18 months of the conflict. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The question remains, why was the P-47 so extraordinarily survivable? What specific design decisions, made years before the aircraft ever entered combat, gave it the ability to absorb punishment that would destroy other fighters? The answer begins with the engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp was not chosen for the Thunderbolt because it was damage-resistant. That was a fortunate side effect. It was chosen because it was the most powerful engine available that could be coupled with an effective turbo supercharger system to maintain performance at high altitude. The Army Air Corps specification that led to the P-47 called for a fighter capable of intercepting enemy bombers at 30,000 feet or higher, altitudes where most existing fighters lost power and maneuverability. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, understood that achieving that performance would require both a powerful engine and a supercharging system far more sophisticated than the simple mechanical superchargers used on most fighters. The solution was a turbo supercharger, essentially a turbine driven by exhaust gases that compressed incoming air before feeding it to the engine. This allowed the engine to maintain near sea-level power output, even at extreme altitudes, where the thin air would normally starve the engine of oxygen. But packaging a turbo supercharger into a fighter aircraft was extraordinarily difficult. The turbine had to be located behind the pilot, near the tail, to balance the weight of the engine in the nose. This required long ducts to route air from the intake under the engine back to the turbo, and then route the compressed air forward again. These ducts were large, nearly a foot in diameter in some places, and they had to be smooth internally to minimize turbulence and pressure losses. The result was that the entire belly of the P-47 was essentially filled with ducting, leaving very little room for anything else. This created a design problem. In most fighters, fuel tanks were located in the fuselage near the center of gravity, but in the Thunderbolt, that space was occupied by turbo supercharger components. The solution was to place fuel tanks under the cockpit floor and in the wings. This had safety benefits. A fuel tank located beneath an armored cockpit floor was much harder to hit than one located behind the pilot, but it also limited internal fuel capacity. The P-47's combat radius in its early variants was disappointingly short, and it was only with the addition of external drop tanks that the aircraft could perform the long-range escort missions for which it was theoretically designed. But that same turbo supercharger ducting, which caused so many design headaches, turned out to save lives. In multiple documented cases, P-47s that crash-landed or were forced down with battle damage showed that the ducts had absorbed impact forces, acting as a structural cushion between the ground and the pilot. This was never an intended function, it was simply a beneficial accident of the design, but it contributed to the aircraft's reputation for bringing pilots home alive. The radial engine itself was inherently more damage-resistant than inline engines. An inline engine, whether the Rolls-Royce Merlin in the P-51 Mustang and Spitfire, or the Daimler-Benz DB605 in the Bf109, had all its cylinders arranged in a line or a V-shape, with a single crankshaft and a liquid cooling system. Hit the cooling system, and the engine would overheat and seize. Hit the crankshaft or the reduction gearbox, and the engine would fail catastrophically. Hit a cylinder in just the right way, and you could crack the engine block and cause immediate failure. Radial engines, by contrast, had their cylinders arranged in a circle around the crankshaft. Each cylinder was independently cooled by airflow, with no liquid cooling system to rupture. If one cylinder was damaged or destroyed, the other cylinders continued to function. A Thunderbolt could lose 2, 3, even 4 cylinders, and still produce enough power to fly home. There are documented cases of P-47s returning to base with entire cylinder heads shot away, oil streaming from the damaged engine, running rough but still running. The structural strength of the airframe was another critical factor. Republic Aviation built the P-47 heavy, and not by accident. Alexander Kartveli understood that an aircraft designed to carry heavy external loads, bombs, rockets, drop tanks, needed a robust wing structure. The main wing spar was massive, designed with generous safety margins. The wing ribs were closely spaced, providing multiple load paths so that damage to one section did not compromise the entire structure. The wing skin was thicker than on most contemporary fighters. All of this added weight, which hurt climb rate and acceleration, but it also meant that the P-47 could take hits to the wings and keep flying. Bullet holes in the wing, the structure held cannon shell detonations in the wing. As long as they missed the main spar, the wing remained intact. Flak fragments tearing through control surfaces. The aircraft remained controllable. The armor protection was extensive. The pilot sat behind a thick plate of face-hardened steel, typically 3/8 of an inch thick, angled to deflect incoming fire. This plate would stop any rifle-caliber round and most pistol-caliber cannon shells. Additional armor protected the oil tank, which if punctured could coat the windscreen and blind the pilot. The windscreen itself was made of thick laminated glass, designed to resist bird strikes at high speed, but also providing some protection against small arms fire. The cockpit sides had armor plate as well, protecting against attacks from the side or rear quarter. A pilot sitting in a P-47 cockpit was essentially surrounded by protective steel, with only the canopy above and the thin aluminum floor below representing vulnerable areas. The self-sealing fuel tanks were state-of-the-art for their time. The technology was not unique to the P-47. Most American and British aircraft used similar systems, but the implementation was particularly effective. The fuel tanks were lined with multiple layers of rubber and fabric. When a bullet punctured the tank, gasoline would leak into the space between the layers, causing the rubber to swell and seal the hole. The process was not instantaneous. There would be some fuel loss, but it prevented the catastrophic fuel leakage that could lead to fire or fuel exhaustion. In combat, this meant that a P-47 with perforated fuel tanks could still have enough fuel remaining to reach friendly territory, whereas an aircraft with non-sealing tanks would lose all its fuel in minutes. The .850 caliber machine guns, while heavy and requiring substantial ammunition storage, gave the Thunderbolt firepower that few other fighters could match. Each gun fired at approximately 800 rounds per minute, and with all 8 guns synchronized, the P-47 could put out a combined fire rate of over 6,000 rounds per minute. A 2-second burst from all guns would fire more than 200 bullets, creating a cone of lead nearly 30 feet in diameter at 300 yards. No aircraft could survive flying through that. German pilots quickly learned to respect the Thunderbolt's frontal firepower. Head-on attacks, which were tactically sound against bombers or lightly armed fighters, were suicidal against a P-47. But perhaps the most important factor in the Thunderbolt's survivability was not engineering, it was doctrine. American fighter tactics evolved to exploit the P-47's strengths and minimize its weaknesses. Thunderbolt pilots were taught to fight from altitude, diving on enemy fighters and using superior speed to dictate engagement terms. If attacked, they were taught to roll and dive away, using the aircraft's excellent roll rate and diving speed to escape. They were discouraged from trying to turn fight with German fighters at medium or low altitude, where the Thunderbolt's weight was a liability. These tactics, sometimes called boom and zoom, played to the aircraft's strengths and kept pilots alive. A pilot who understood his aircraft and flew it properly had a very good chance of surviving his combat tour. A pilot who tried to dogfight a Bf-109 at 10,000 feet did not. The Germans, for their part, adapted their own tactics to counter the Thunderbolt. The most effective approach was to avoid the escorts entirely and focus on attacking the bombers. If engagement with P-47s was unavoidable, German pilots were taught to attack from advantageous positions diving out of the sun, attacking from the rear quarter where the American pilot had limited visibility in early Razorback variants, breaking off before the Thunderbolt could reverse and bring its guns to bear. These tactics required discipline and situational awareness. A German pilot who allowed himself to be drawn into a prolonged engagement with a P-47, especially if the American had an altitude advantage, was likely to be shot down or, at minimum, forced to break off without achieving anything. The air war over Europe in 1944 became, in many ways, a battle of doctrine as much as a battle of hardware. Both sides had capable aircraft. Both sides had skilled pilots. What mattered was how those aircraft and pilots were employed, what tactics were used, what risks were accepted or avoided. The P-47's reputation for survivability was not just about armor and radial engines, it was about an entire system of training, tactics, maintenance, and logistics that allowed the aircraft to be used effectively. By the summer of 1944, the strategic air war over Europe had fundamentally shifted. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous, no one disputed that, but German fighter units were outnumbered, short of fuel, and forced to defend an ever-shrinking perimeter. The 8th Air Force and the 9th Air Force together could put up more than 1,000 heavy bombers on a single raid, escorted by 600 or 700 fighters. The Germans could muster perhaps 200 or 300 interceptors, and many of those were flown by inexperienced pilots who had fewer than 50 hours in type. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and inexorable. The P-47's role evolved. As longer-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang took over the bomber escort missions deep into Germany, the Thunderbolt increasingly shifted to ground attack. Its ability to carry bombs, rockets, and gun pods made it an effective fighter bomber, and its ruggedness made it ideal for low-altitude missions where flak and small arms fire were constant threats. Thunderbolt pilots attacked trains, trucks, tanks, bridges, airfields, anything that moved or supported the German war effort. These missions were extraordinarily dangerous. Flying low and slow over heavily defended targets meant exposure to intense anti-aircraft fire, and the loss rates were higher than in air-to-air combat. But the P-47 absorbed this punishment better than other aircraft. Pilots came back with aircraft so badly damaged that maintenance crews shook their heads in wonder that the machines were still flying. Holes in the wings, holes in the fuselage, engines trailing oil and running on half their cylinders, hydraulic systems shot away, and yet, time and again, the Thunderbolts made it home. From D-Day on June 6, 1944, until VE Day on May 8, 1945, Thunderbolt pilots flew relentless ground attack missions in support of Allied armies, advancing across France, Belgium, and Germany. The aircraft they flew were increasingly beat up, war-weary machines that had been patched and repaired dozens of times. The pilots themselves were exhausted, flying multiple missions per day, living in tents or hastily requisitioned buildings, eating field rations, and trying to sleep through the noise of artillery and air raids. But they kept flying, because the alternative allowing German armoured columns or supply convoys to move unmolested was unacceptable. The statistics compiled after the war tell the story in stark numbers. P-47 Thunderbolts flew more than 746,000 combat sorties in all theatres of operation. They claimed 3,752 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat at a kill ratio of 4.6 to 1. But their contribution to ground operations was even more significant. The claimed destruction figures are staggering. 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armoured vehicles, 68,000 trucks. These numbers likely include some overclaiming it was notoriously difficult for pilots to accurately assess damage in the chaos of a strafing run. But even if the actual figures were half of what was claimed, the impact on German logistics and mobility was devastating. Trains could not run, trucks could not move supplies, tanks could not advance without fuel. The German army, which had built its doctrine around mobility and mechanized warfare, found itself increasingly pinned down and unable to maneuver. The cost, however, was real. 3,499 P-47s were lost to all causes in combat. That is a significant number, though the loss rate as a percentage of sorties flown was low, approximately 0.7%, one of the best survival rates of any American fighter in the war. Each lost aircraft represented not just destroyed hardware, but also, in many cases, a dead or captured pilot. Some pilots bailed out and were rescued, some crash-landed and walked away, but some died in burning cockpits or were killed by ground fire or simply disappeared, their aircraft disintegrating over enemy territory with no witnesses and no wreckage ever found. The P-47 was survivable, yes, but it was not invulnerable. Nothing in war is invulnerable. Robert Johnson, the pilot who had survived that terrible mission on June 26, 1943, went on to become one of the 8th Air Force's leading aces. He flew a total of 89 combat missions, scoring 27 confirmed aerial victories. His final kill came on May 8, 1944, breaking Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories and making Johnson the highest-scoring American fighter pilot in the European theatre at that time. He was promoted to captain and then major, and he served as operations officer for the 62nd Fighter Squadron. In June of 1944, having completed his extended combat tour, he returned to the United States. He survived the war, married, raised a family, and lived until 1998. He wrote an autobiography, Thunderbolt, co-authored with aviation writer Martin Caidin, which remains one of the finest first-person accounts of aerial combat ever published. In that book, he reflected on the aircraft that had saved his life and the lives of so many others. The Jug was a wonderful airplane. It was big, heavy, and tough. It could take more punishment than any other fighter I knew of, and it could dish out more punishment too. Egon Meyer, the German ace who had shot up Johnson's aircraft and then saluted him in respect, was not so fortunate. He continued to fly combat missions through 1943 and into 1944, scoring victories and training younger pilots. But on March 2, 1944, while leading his unit in an attack on American bombers, Meyer's Bf-109 was hit by defensive fire from the bombers. He was killed, and his aircraft crashed near Montmédy in northeastern France. He was 27 years old and credited with 102 aerial victories. His loss was a blow to the Luftwaffe, which could ill afford to lose experienced leaders. The men who had fought at the beginning of the war, who had learned their craft in Spain and Poland and as the Battle of Britain, were dying off, and the replacements did not have their skill or their tactical judgment. Heinz Baer, the ace who had described the P-47's ability to absorb damage, survived the war, one of the few high-scoring German aces to do so. He ended the war flying Me-2 jet fighters with Jagdverband 44, a special unit composed of veteran pilots. He scored 16 victories in jets, adding to his total of 220 kills over the course of the war. After the war, he worked as a test pilot and aviation consultant. He died in a light aircraft crash in 1957, still flying, still pushing the limits of what aircraft could do. Lieutenant William Roach, whose forced landing had given the Germans their first complete P-47, spent the rest of the war as a prisoner at Stalag Luft 1, a camp for captured Allied airmen in northern Germany. He survived the war, and was liberated by Soviet forces in May of 1945. What he thought about the fact that his aircraft had been used to train German pilots to fight against his fellow Americans is not recorded. Perhaps he took some small comfort in the knowledge that, by war's end, all the intelligence gained from Beetle had not been enough to alter the outcome. The P-47 Thunderbolt remained in service with the United States Air Force. The name changed from Army Air Forces in 1947 until 1949, when the last examples were retired from active duty. Many were transferred to Allied nations under military assistance programs. France used Thunderbolts in Indochina. China used them in the civil war between nationalists and communists. Several South American air forces flew P-47s well into the 1950s. The aircraft had found its niche, a rugged, reliable, maintainable fighter bomber that could operate from rough airfields and absorb punishment in low-altitude combat. It was not glamorous, and it never had the sleek sex appeal of the P-51 Mustang, but it worked. Today, a handful of airworthy P-47s remain, maintained by museums and private collectors. They appear at air shows, their massive radial engines bellowing smoke and sound, reminding audiences of an era when propeller-driven fighters ruled the skies. And when those aircraft fly, when they roll and dive and climb, it is impossible not to think about the men who flew them in combat, who trusted their lives to those engines and that airframe, and who came home alive because the Thunderbolt refused to die. There is a deeper irony embedded in this story, one that extends beyond the simple narrative of German pilots underestimating an ungainly American fighter. The irony is this: the P-47 was never supposed to be a ground attack aircraft. It was designed, from the beginning, as a high-altitude interceptor. The entire reason for its bulk, its weight, its complex turbo-supercharger system was to enable it to fight at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where German bombers, hypothetical German bombers that never actually materialized in the numbers or at the altitudes predicted, would operate. The aircraft was optimized for a mission that never really happened, at least not in the way the pre-war planners had imagined. And yet, when the real war imposed different requirements, the Thunderbolt adapted. Its ruggedness, which was a byproduct of design choices made for entirely different reasons, turned out to be exactly what was needed for low-altitude ground attack. Its ability to carry heavy loads, designed into the airframe to accommodate future weapons development, made it an excellent platform for bombs and rockets. Its radial engine, chosen for power at altitude, proved to be remarkably resistant to ground fire. The aircraft succeeded, but not by doing what it was designed to do. It succeeded by being robust enough to be adapted to missions its designers had never fully anticipated. This is a pattern repeated throughout military history. Equipment designed for one purpose finds its greatest utility in a completely different role. Tactics developed for one kind of war turn out to be essential in another. The generals prepare to fight the last war and then find themselves improvising their way through the current one. The P-47 is a case study in this phenomenon. It was the right aircraft at the right time, but not for the reasons anyone expected. The German experience with the captured Thunderbolt illustrates a different aspect of the same irony. By the time the Luftwaffe had fully analyzed the P-47's strengths and weaknesses, by the time the Rosarius Circus had toured the fighter bases and trained pilots on proper engagement tactics, it no longer mattered. The strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where tactical knowledge could not overcome material inferiority. The Germans knew how to fight the Thunderbolt effectively. They understood its vulnerabilities. They had developed sound doctrine for engaging it. But they did not have enough fuel to fly their own fighters. They did not have enough experienced pilots to implement the tactics. They did not have enough time to train replacements properly. Knowledge without resources is just knowledge. There is something profoundly poignant about the image of the Rosarius Circus in its final months, a handful of captured Allied aircraft, barely flyable due to lack of parts and fuel, touring German bases to teach pilots tactics they would never have the opportunity to use. It was a symbol of desperation, masked as professionalism. The Luftwaffe was still trying to fight the war systematically, still trying to apply lessons learned and improve pilot training, even as the industrial and logistical foundation of the German war effort crumbled. It was admirable in a way, this refusal to simply give up, but it was also futile. The story of the P-47 in World War II is, ultimately, a story about resilience. Not just the mechanical resilience of the aircraft itself, though that is impressive, but the human resilience of the pilots who flew it, the maintainers who kept it operational under impossible conditions, and even the German pilots who learned to respect an enemy they had initially dismissed. War is a test of resilience. Machines break, men break, entire military forces break. What matters is how long it takes, and what happens in the meantime. The P-47 did not break easily, neither did the men who flew it, and that, in the end, is why they won. Consider what it must have been like to be a German fighter pilot in the summer of 1944, after the Normandy invasion. After the Rosarius Circus had come through your base and shown you exactly how formidable the American fighters were. You are 20 years old, perhaps 21. You have 60 hours in the Bf-109, maybe 70 if you were lucky. Your training was cut short because the front needed pilots immediately. You have flown perhaps a dozen combat missions, and you have learned the most important lesson: stay alive. Score victories if you can, but mainly stay alive. Come back from each mission so you can fly the next one. You take off on a bomber interception mission. Your orders are clear. Ignore the fighters if possible. Go for the bombers. The bombers are the threat. The bombers are destroying German cities and factories. Shoot down bombers. You climb to altitude, and you see them a formation of B-17s, flying in their defensive boxes, bristling with guns. And above them, weaving back and forth, are the American fighters. P-47s. You recognize them instantly. The distinctive silhouette, the broad cowling, the thick wings. You know what the instructors told you. You remember the circus demonstration. Avoid head-on attacks. Do not try to turn with them at low altitude. If you attack, make one pass, hit hard, and get out. Do not linger. Do not assume that hits will bring them down. But you are 20 years old, and this is your first time seeing the enemy, and your flight leader is diving toward the bombers, and you follow because that is what you are supposed to do. And then the American fighters roll over and dive on your formation, and suddenly the sky is full of aircraft turning and firing, and you have lost sight of your flight leader, and you are alone. A P-47 is turning toward you. You see the muzzle flashes from its guns. You brake hard left, feel the G-forces press you into your seat, and the tracers pass behind you. You reverse, trying to get into firing position, but the Thunderbolt is already rolling the other direction and diving away, accelerating to a speed you cannot match. You try to follow, but you are too slow, too far behind, and the P-47 is extending away, and then it is gone, diving toward the deck, out of sight. You did not shoot it down. It did not shoot you down. You both survive this encounter, but you have learned something. The aircraft you were told was slow and clumsy is neither of those things when flown by a competent pilot. It is fast in a dive. It rolls quickly, and its guns, those 850 caliber machine guns, are terrifying. You return to base, land, and make your report. The intelligence officer nods and writes down your observations. You are not the first pilot to report this. You will not be the last. This happens again the next day, and the day after that. You survive each mission, but the odds are accumulating against you. Statistically, every combat sortie you fly increases the probability that you will be shot down. If you fly 50 missions, the odds say you will be killed or captured. If you fly 100 missions and there are German pilots who flew that many, the odds say you should be dead several times over. The only way to beat those odds is skill, luck, and discipline. Take unnecessary risks. Do not try to be a hero. Survive. Some pilots cannot accept this calculus. They are aggressive, brave, and doomed. They press attacks they should break off. They chase damaged aircraft into the weeds and get shot down by ground fire. They turn to fight when they should run. They die, usually quickly, sometimes slowly if they are wounded and their aircraft crashes in enemy territory. Their names are added to the casualty lists. Their staffel gets a replacement, another young pilot with minimal training, and the cycle continues. The survivors, the ones who live through months of combat, learn a kind of grim pragmatism. They fight when they must, disengage when they can, and conserve their energy and ammunition for situations where they have a real advantage. They do not chase thunderbolts into dives. They do not accept turning fights at low altitude. They pick their battles, and they come home alive. By 1945, these survivors are the backbone of the Luftwaffe, but there are not enough of them, and they are exhausted. Now, shift perspective again. You are an American P-47 pilot, also in the summer of 1944. You are 22 years old. You have completed your training in the United States, ferried a new aircraft across the Atlantic, and joined your squadron in England. You have perhaps 20 combat missions under your belt. You are not yet an ace. You have one confirmed kill, maybe two, but you are competent and confident. You trust your aircraft. You have seen what it can survive. You have seen other pilots come back with their Thunderbolts shot full of holes, and the aircraft held together. You have learned the tactics: maintain altitude, dive on the enemy, use your speed to control the engagement, do not get suckered into low-altitude turning fights. Today's mission is escorting bombers hitting synthetic oil plants deep in Germany. You take off before dawn, form up with your squadron, and climb to altitude. The sun is rising behind you as you cross the channel. You can see the French coast ahead, and you know that somewhere over that coast, German fighters are taking off to intercept you. This knowledge is both frightening and exhilarating. Frightening because combat is always frightening, no matter how much training you have had. Exhilarating because you are good at this, and you are flying an aircraft that gives you every advantage except pure maneuverability, and you have learned to work around that limitation. The rendezvous with the bombers happens on schedule. You throttle back and take up position above and behind the bomber formation, weaving back and forth to maintain airspeed. The bombers are flying straight and level, maintaining their tight defensive formation. You scan the sky constantly, looking for the dark specks that will be enemy fighters. Your neck will ache by the end of this mission from the constant swiveling, but you do not notice. The discomfort is irrelevant. What matters is seeing the enemy before they see you, and then you see them 12 o'clock high, several thousand feet above, diving toward the bombers. You call them out over the radio. Your flight leader confirms. Brake right and engage. You roll into the turn, pulling 4 Gs, the aircraft responding smoothly despite its weight. You are now diving toward the German fighters, who are diving toward the bombers. This is a geometry problem. You need to intercept them before they reach the bombers. You push the throttle forward, and the big Pratt & Whitney engine responds with a surge of power. Your airspeed increases, 500 miles per hour, 520, 540. You are diving nearly vertically now, the Earth rotating below you, and the German fighters are growing larger in your windscreen. You select one target, a Bf-109, and line up your gun sight. Wait. The range is closing rapidly. Wait. You want to be sure. Wait. At 300 yards, you press the trigger. All 8 guns open fire simultaneously. The recoil slows your aircraft slightly. You see your tracers arc toward the German fighter. You see hits sparking along the fuselage and wing. The Messerschmitt breaks hard left, trailing smoke. You do not know if you killed the pilot or just damaged his aircraft severely enough that he has to disengage, and you do not have time to find out. There are other targets. You pull up from the dive, bleeding off speed, looking for another engagement. But the German fighters are scattering, some diving away, some turning hard to evade, and the moment of vulnerability is past. The bombers are safe, for now. You escort the bombers to their target. You watch them drop their bombs. You escort them back out of German airspace, across occupied France, across the Channel, back to England. You land with 2 hours and 40 minutes of flight time logged, and your maintenance crew counts 4 small-caliber bullet holes in your wings. You took some defensive fire from the German fighters, but nothing serious. The holes will be patched before your next mission tomorrow. This is your war. Not one dramatic life or death encounter like Robert Johnson's, but rather a series of missions, each dangerous, each requiring skill and concentration, each survivable if you do everything right. The victories accumulate slowly. The close calls accumulate too. You see friends shot down. You see aircraft lost. But you also see the bombers getting through, the German war machine slowly grinding down under the weight of Allied material superiority, and you understand that you are part of something larger than yourself. You are a small component in an enormous military effort, but your component matters. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.